the powers that be, the researchers have decided there really isn't a difference between high functioning autism and Asperger's. So now it's been combined in the DSM. So Asperger's has been removed from the diagnostic criteria. I don't know that I agree with that. That's just, they didn't consult me when they rewrote the DSM, so that's just what the route they went. In the past, the only thing that I really had diagnostically to distinguish between high functioning autism, which by definition they have average or above average IQ, which is another issue I have because all the IQ tests, the standard IQ tests that we give, are not normed for those on the spectrum. So we're talking about processing the world differently, so I don't know if that's necessarily a fair assessment, but that's part of the definition of high functioning autism, is that they have an average or above average IQ. Asperger's individuals, also very intelligent. I would say potentially a higher IQ. The only thing we could really use in the past to distinguish between high functioning autism and Asperger's was the language development. So those that were that had autism, that met the autism criteria, had difficulty with either they didn't develop language, so they didn't start talking, or they developed 15, 20 words, and by about 18 months to 2 years they started regressing. That's called Kanner's autism or regressive autism. So they had the language and then they lost it. So there was a language component there for a diagnosis of autism. They either don't have it or they lost it. For Asperger's individuals, they develop language when they should. So at 9 months, a year, they're starting to talk. Generally speaking, the languages skyrocket. They're very verbal. What they lack is the pragmatic language or the social language. So I'll get a 3-year-old that knows every dinosaur, can pronounce it. I get a 3-year-old that can do the alphabet forwards and backwards just as fast. I have a 4-year-old right now that can memorize any cartoon that he watches. He doesn't know what any of it means, but he sees it one time and he can memorize it. So the language explodes, generally speaking, with those with Asperger's, or at least it's not delayed. So it develops when it should. So really that was the only thing in the past that we could use to distinguish between high-functioning autism and Asperger's. Those with autism tend to be, generally speaking, more impaired if you have an autism diagnosis and you're not in the high-functioning range. And again, I think it's just, in my opinion, it's the level of autism correlates with the level of difficulty processing the world in the sensory environment. So the more impacted you are, I think the more autistic you are. The less impacted, the higher functioning. So now it's autistic spectrum. So everybody's kind of in the same boat. What they changed in the past for the autism diagnosis, you had the communication issue, the language issue, you had the social issue, and then you had the restrictive interest, repetitive behavior, stereotypical movement. Those 3 categories, you had to fall in each of those 3 categories to receive an autism diagnosis. The Asperger's diagnosis was exactly the same minus the communication issue. So they had the social issues and the restrictive interest, repetitive behaviors, in order to get a diagnosis of Asperger's disorder. Now what they've done is that we rate level of severity for those on the autism spectrum. So how severe is it? And then they've eliminated the communication component. So it's the social and it's the restrictive interest, repetitive behaviors. There are many tasks that we do as human beings that I call associative tasks, which are things we can do multiple things at one time. So you can drive, you can talk on your phone, both at the same time. You can look at me, you can listen to me, maybe you can take notes. All 3 of those activities are associative tasks because you can look, listen, and write at the same time. What you're describing, what happens with some of the kids and young adults that I see, is most of the tasks that are associative for other people are actually cognitive for them. So what you're describing with this young lady is she can look, but that takes all of her energy. She can't look and listen at the same time. Or eye contact specifically overwhelms her system, so then she can't listen at the same time. So one of the good things to do when interacting or working with individuals on the spectrum is to figure out which of those tasks are cognitive and which are associative. So I have some very bright kids, and I'll go to the science teacher and say, you have to provide them with notes for your class. And they'll say, but they're the smartest kid in my class. And I'll try to explain, they can't listen to you and look at you and take notes at the same time. They can't do all 3 of those things. Your other students can, but they cannot. And I think that's also where the hyperfocus comes in, where it's like a laser beam. When you focus on something, it's off the charts. That's one of your superpowers. But at the same time, everything else gets tuned out because generally we're not doing multiple things at one time. We're hyper-focused in one area. I think it's a gift. That, like I said, it's one of your superpowers. And that's where a lot of our inventions come from, is that ability to stay focused, where I don't have that ability.
I like that you're referring to some of these things as superpowers, because I think that a lot of people view like Asperger's and autism as like a deficit and only a deficit.
That's incorrect. Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. It's how do you harness the superpower? So I tell a lot of the kids that I see, and I fall in this category, I think everybody does, where there's things that I'm good at and things that I'm not, period. For me to be successful, I have to recognize those two categories, things I'm good at and things that I'm not. And for me to be successful, I take advantage of what I'm good at and compensate for areas that I'm not. So you talked earlier about, your emotions and how you react. So you're obviously very intelligent, so that's a gift that you have. Your hyperfocus is a gift. You have superpowers that the rest of us don't possess. If there are areas that you struggle with, you have to use your intellect and your superpowers to compensate. So that's what we talked before about self-advocating, just explaining to people. Your job then becomes, how do I educate people on how I process the world? That's a gift that you have. And if you do that, life gets a lot easier. So part of my job, part of your job, is to educate people on what's really going on. I think in the world, I think things that are different sometimes scare people. So when they see somebody that's reacting different, that's responding different, that's talking different, that creates anxiety in people. And that's because they're uneducated. They just don't understand. I wish more people would get educated. We keep working at that. But that's where your job is, to educate those people, like the documentary.
That's why I'm making the
Yeah.
documentary.
And the more people that watch it, I think the more people that will learn and understand. Because I think, again, we're sometimes I see people that are treating those on the spectrum like they're aliens or something. They're not different than us. They just process the world a little bit differently. If we don't educate people, that poses a pretty big problem for work, for employers, for schools, for teachers, for roommates, for classmates. So a lot of times, and as we talked about before, it's self-advocating. It's the student, it's you speaking up on your behalf. I get questions a lot, should I tell my employer that I'm on the spectrum? Well, once again, if you don't, and you don't educate them, you run the risk of doing something that offends them or that's incorrect with the way they want things to operate and losing your job because of it, as opposed to working with that person and educating them. So I think so much of it comes from the student or the person themselves self-advocating. And then it's other people getting educated. It's watching your documentary. It's reading books. It's trying to gain knowledge. I think there's so many young people now that are coming into the workforce, that are coming into the world. It's almost inundating the workforce. So I think as employers, it would be in their best interest to understand some of these individuals by seeking out that knowledge. There's so much out there.
I don't know. Just social interaction in general. Like what advice would you give?
That's a great question. It's a challenge because it's different if somebody is more introverted or more extroverted. So it's much harder to stimulate social interaction with somebody that's truly introverted, because they're really not bothered if they don't have friends. They're really not wanting to seek friends out. They'd rather stay in their room. They don't want to join any clubs. So there a couple components come in. It's motivation. What is the student's motivation to be social? Are they motivated to be social? How do we motivate them? So with the summer coming, with a lot of the introverted kids, what I'll set up with families is every hour you're outside with the neighbor kids is an hour you can be in your room. Otherwise, they won't be outside with the neighbor kids. They won't be running around. So it's motivation, and then it's exposure. So remember we talked before, if being social creates anxiety for me, it's very easy for me to avoid the anxiety. Guess what I do? I don't be social. I don't go outside. I don't join clubs. I don't talk to people at school. So we have to work on the anxiety piece to try to bring that in check. But then it's motivation and exposure. So it's how do we get out? How do we get them involved? And then we teach them what to do in those situations. So I do a lot of social groups here at the clinic, and my job then is to teach them what to do in that situation. So I can motivate them, I can put them in the situation, but if I haven't taught them how to interact or what to say, how to communicate, what to talk about, it doesn't happen. So in the past, I've had teachers say, oh, we just put him in the lunchroom, him or her in the lunchroom, and have him sit at a table with his peers. Well, that's not going to work if he or she doesn't know what to say there. Or if they're anxious because it's so loud, they gain zero from that social experience, absolutely nothing. So an example, I had a group years and years ago of five boys that were more introverted, middle school boys, and I had them in a group. And we were sitting around, and I'd say, okay, John, can you ask Pete what he did over the weekend? And John looked at me and said, Dr. Wahlberg, I don't care what Pete did over the weekend. So I'm thinking, man, now what do I do? Because these guys aren't talking. They're not asking questions. They don't care. So I said, I tell you what, guys, I have a few groups I'm doing right now. Whichever of my groups asks the most questions during their group time, I'm going to have a pizza party. And they said, right here in the group? I said, absolutely. Right here in the group. I will bring pizza in, but it's only for the group that asks the most questions. So 45 minutes later, they had asked 180 questions. So they went from 0 to 180, and they'd say something. They'd say, John, what'd you do over the weekend? And they'd look at me and say, Dr. Wahlberg, that is a question. And I'd mark it on the board, 180 questions. So what starts to happen then, now I have the motivation piece. I've taught them how to do it, taught them what appropriate questions are to make it pertinent to what the people in group have said. Well, now that kind of becomes habitual. So that and I had a pizza party, of course, and that becomes habitual now for them. Now they know the rules of the social group. So they follow those rules in my social group, and that becomes a habit. And then what I see that starts to change now is I've asked questions about you, and I start to remember some of the things that you've done since the last group. So I might say to you, hey, how was that trip you took this weekend camping? Where did you go? How was it? So when I start group, and this takes a long time to develop, it might take a year and a half, 2 years, but I'll come into group, and the guys and the ladies are talking before the group starts. They'll say, hey, how was that trip last weekend? And you'll answer them, and you'll have a social exchange based on what they've learned to do. A lot of times the introverted kids don't understand what's to be gained by a social interaction, that it can actually be kind of fun, that it can be entertaining. So often the anxiety is so high that they're not able to manage that. So it might take months in my group for the anxiety to go down so they can just tolerate being around other people and talking with other people. With the extroverted kids that I see, they're in the game almost to a fault. They're in the mix of things. They're wanting to have friends. They're talking to people. They're engaging with people. And unfortunately, when they start to annoy people, which can happen sometimes, the wrong group kind of accepts them, and they sometimes can get in with kids that aren't so good, just because that's how it works out sometimes. But you still need the motivation to do things correctly. So with extroverted kids, they might talk about their topic and not understand that other people have things to say as well. So I'll have a rule, for instance, they maybe can't read that somebody's getting glazed over because you've talked about your topic of stoplights for the last 20 minutes and they are done with stoplights. So we'll have a rule. I can't necessarily teach them how to read the social language, the pragmatics, the nonverbals, but I can say, you're going to ask if you want to hear about stoplights. And if they say yes, you're going to tell them 3 details of stoplights. After the 3rd detail, you're going to say, would you like to hear more about stoplights? If they say no, then you're going to ask them what they would like to talk about. So I can structure some social rules within that context to teach them how to manage. Otherwise, they can dominate a conversation. And then they don't understand why other people are put off by that. If for parents, again, it's educating teachers, it's educating neighbors, family members. It's trying to motivate the child to get in I call it being in the game. If you want to get better, you have to play the game. The game is life. You can't sit in your bedroom and play on your computer and learn about the game of life. What makes individuals such as yourself prosper is the functional skills. So generally speaking, for me, it's not about intellect with the kids that I see. Rarely do I talk about academics. It's the functional skills. It's how'd you get up this morning and get here on time? You set an alarm, the functional skills that you need to do. You stay organized. You were flexible. Things didn't work out for us last night, right? The lighting was bad. Not what you had planned, not what I had planned, right?
Yeah.
But did we adapt? Did you adapt to it?
I did.
Absolutely. That's functional skills. So I taught a class last week in Texas, and I'd never said this before, never thought this before, but somebody asked a question about functional skills after high school, and I realized I have never had a student not graduate high school. Not one of the thousands I've seen. So that the high school, the educational system helps them through, but what are we teaching as far as functional skills? Not too much. So then are they ready for the real world? Not so much, because of the lack of functional skills, which is problem solving, social skills, executive functioning. It's managing your sensory environment. How do we do a better job of teaching those skills? And I think some of it has to come through public education, which is hard because they're not designed to do that. That's not how they're set up. They're designed to educate. So if you have a reading disability, they know exactly what to do. But what happens if you have a social disability? They don't know what to do. And most people learn social skills just by walking through the front door. And now I have a group of individuals that doesn't learn the same way. Walking through the front door, they need more than that. They need to be educated on what to do once they get through the front door. The other kids know what to do. The other kids know how to manage that. They learn social skills all day, every day. So I think a lot of programming, in order to meet the needs to change, to set up learning the executive functioning, problem solving, social skills, organization. How do you stay organized?